Hello, and thank you for attending this talk. So, my argument in this paper is really a rather simple one, and the reason I'm making it comes out of a concern which I think many share that digital emphasis is leading us too far away from the cultural and humanistic components in fieldwork. As my focus in this talk will hopefully show, the positioning of transcribed digital data to empirical primacy, in fact, constrains the purview of our research. I'm going to start with a statement representing the position I'm arguing against. Gunther Zempt, based on his fieldwork in New Guinea, offers another perspective. Even when we do record speech events in another language, the culturally specific nature of the content means that the meanings attributed to linguistic substance require the work of fieldwork to be not only documentary but deeply participatory. If you can excuse my hodgepodge cartography here, on this slide and the next, I'll zoom into Chini territory for you. Chini country is situated in northeast New Guinea, in inland Madang province, in two villages on the lower Sogran River, as depicted in the dark green square in the bottom left. And as enlarged here in this image, where you can also see the hamlet of Akapmunga, the place I call home during my visits. Akapmunga is the largest of the Chini hamlets. You can see the roofs of people's houses here if you're able to zoom in. So, this talk is reflective of a change in my own fieldwork practice, which began as a fairly standard ELDP funded type of intensive documentation project, but has changed to a participation centered approach. I've spent a total of about 16 months there in Andamang since I first went in 2012, having had about, I think it's a total of 6 or maybe 7 visits since then. Some more background here on participant observation before we get started. As a number of other scholars have pointed out in different ways, inclusion of a strong participatory component in fieldwork has a number of important ethical, empirical, and theoretical implications for linguists. As I'll show in the rest of this talk, my own immersive participation in Chini sociolinguistic life was not just how I learned about the joking register in Chini, but it was the only way that I could have. We know next to nothing about the linguistics of joking registers in New Guinea. Gunta Zempt's work in the Trobriand Islands is really the main exception to that. Otherwise, we just have a few fleeting mentions or an example or two in a grammar of a few New Guinea languages here and there. We do know quite a bit about joking in New Guinea from various perspectives in anthropology. One general rule is that joking relationships in that part of the world tend to be between cross cousins, that is, cousins through the opposite sex parent, and through same sex in laws of the same generation. As I'll discuss here shortly, it's similar but different in Chini society. Before we can talk about joking relationships, some of the Chini cultural basics are important to keep in mind. I want to focus our attention especially on the kin relation of the father's elder sister, abbreviated in kinship notation as Fez, and her relationship to her sons in law. Chini society, like several other neighboring societies in the Middle Ramu, is based upon a division into two affiliations called moieties. Though it's somewhat more complicated than this, in general, people get their moiety, associated clan affiliation, and land rights through the mother. Everyone has two Chini names, one for each moiety. As is common throughout New Guinea, you don't call your in laws by name. But in Chini society, the one person who breaks both name rules is a woman who will call her son in law by name and co-moetically. If there are any anthropologists listening to this, I do apologize for making up an adjective for moiety. It's just easier that way. Socially liminal characters, people with fraught social status, tend to be the ones who take up the jokester personality. When we are talking about bona fide joking relationships, relational fraughtness can also be seen as playing a central role. One of these relationships is the Apmunguaru, a man's male cross cousins through his father's elder sister. The other joking relationship is the Amangyana relation, a man's cross cousin in law, the spouse of the father's elder sister's daughter. The Apmunguara relationship is especially intimate, but not without some fraughtness due to competition among one's various cousins, whereas the Amangyana relationship as an in law is inherently fraught, but the relational intimacy that passes through your father's elder sister makes this in law relationship unique. An in law who is also an intimate. So, one thing for which Melanesia is famous, and I ought to mention, is their assimilative cultural posture towards outsiders. There are exceptions, but Chini is not one of them, and I was incorporated into their kinship system the moment I arrived in Andamang. Told what my name is and what relationship I had to the person who announced this information to me. So, from very early on in my fieldwork, Chini people socialized me on how to interact with a man around my age whose name was Peter, informing me that the two of us have a joking relationship as each other's amangen. But the way that I would start learning to engage in the other type of joking relationship with one's apmunguaru happened in a totally serendipitous way just last year in 2024 after I jokingly took Richard to task on the phone for not showing up for one of my scheduled phone calls. You have to walk about an hour to get mobile service, so it's a bit of a trek. I asked the guys who all was there, but Richard, who's one of my closest friends and my apmunguaru, hadn't come. So I was a little bit disappointed, and I jokingly called him basically lazy in talk pissin. I mean, I used a word that is sort of like it's basically an insult, except they knew that I meant it in a friendly way. Little did I realize, but when I arrived in Andamang, a verbal duel had begun between me and Richard because of my calling him lazy. I had unwittingly engaged Richard in Bumbuar, the Chini joking register. So here, it's very important that you understand my methodology and what I'm saying about it, even in its messiness and its circumstantial nature, rather than the sort of planned way that we want to have our methods pan out. For instance, for me as a Westerner, scientifically inclined type of person. Here, I'm talking about methodology in terms of my immersive participation in Chini social life and how I depended really entirely upon the native theory of language acquisition, which centers parroted speech as a method of learning. There's quite a bit of literature on that, apparently, in the Melanesianist literature. I'm not really familiar with it, so I haven't mentioned any of that here. Parroting is a big deal in native theories of learning in Melanesia. So I had to learn what to say and when, and what counts as a good verbal assault in Bumbuarkna or a failed effort, for instance, as the last example on this slide gives an example of. Here's another example of socialization. Richard's mother, my auntie, so my father's elder sister, that important relationship I mentioned earlier, she had me parrot this to Richard one day when he was in earshot about some unwanted food. She said, "Oh, ngagambri mama, have the lazy villager guy eat it." And here's an example of an Bumbuarkna exchange between me and Richard, also involving some parroted speech. I said to Richard, "Oh, plesman," this is in Tokpisin, "Oh, plesman, meeting osem plesman by ron lek nating, you ron lo gambut osem yukisim pasim lo town mania." Hey, lazy good for nothing. I would have thought a lazy good for nothing would be walking around barefoot, but here you are running around in your boots like some guy from town. Richard says to me, "Oh, bayudina lo minao. You'll be the one in my debt soon enough." And then Ayirava, who is my uncle, said, that I should respond to Richard in this way, this part being in Chini. Mang Guan Matamanda, Ang Dona Rangan Mat. That's not your style, that's the style of white men. Of course, the humor is lost quite a bit in translation. I'll mention something more on that here in a moment. There are diverse natively recognized codes and registers, as there are in many New Guinea languages, and these have native metalinguistic labels as well. This talk is about Bumbuarkn, the last one, but I'll also briefly mention Yopiorkn here in a few slides. So you've seen a couple examples of Bumbuarkn. While all Chini people joke around just as much as people anywhere do, and while there are even local jokesters, as a register, Mbumbuarkna is distinct from everyday joking in a number of ways. First and foremost, it's manifest in and only in these two joking relationships with one's Apmangwara, as I mentioned, and with one's Amangyan. Within those relationships, it has a particular temporality to it as an ongoing verbal duel. In the case of your Amangena, the in-law relationship, you're constantly joking with that person. So it's not a punctual joke, it's ongoing iterations, there's escalation, there's progressive development. And then with your Apmangwara, it can be ongoing or it can come to a conclusion. It differs from individual to individual like anything else. Lastly, the content of Bumbuarkna really flips social norms. There's a lot of sexually explicit talk, reference to genitalia, exaggerated conflict and threats, demands upon the other person's possessions, which is very culturally taboo in Melanesian societies. It has, I admit, come to my surprise to learn that the linguistics of Bumbuarkna is quite extensive. There's no time here to take a deep dive, but the one area of the grammar I would point out is the near grammatical correlate of Bumbuarkna found in a set of possessive pronouns. And there are a number of other features you can see here on the slide. So there are two sets of non-reflexive possessive pronouns in Chini. There's set A, which are the default forms, and then there's mysterious set B. Set B incorporates the proximal deictic k, and these forms are infrequent in the default register, but not in Bumbuarkna. So I will just briefly say that where joking relationships construct an artificial conflict between two participants, the set B forms index socio-pragmatic contrast. In the documentation, you don't have any examples of Bumbuarkna, much less the use of set B forms in Bumbuarkna, but you do have examples of the set B forms in other social contexts where their functions appear to basically be some sort of semantic contrast, but you can see in their use in Bumbuarkna and otherwise that it's socio-pragmatic. Set B is not exclusive to, but is nevertheless especially at home in Bumbuarkna. At this point, I'll pivot to talk about how the example of joking registers in New Guinea exposes a problem in language documentation theory and practice, which I am calling digital undocumentability. And then I'll discuss the solution to it, which is in participatory method. First, let me draw our attention to the reality on the ground of fieldwork in a rural New Guinea village. The idea that you'll record something called naturalistic speech is really pure fantasy. There's too much activity and too much noise to do this thing that we want to do, that is to capture it, to use the hunting metaphor common to documentary linguistic parlance. Among many other points there are to make here, but for which there's no time, I will also just point out that in my own fieldwork, Chini people explicitly interpreted recording events according to one of their own pre-existing discourse styles or registers, calling these recording events yopuyi because of how the cameras cause the social activity to be constrained to sedentary interaction as opposed to the much more active forms of communication that they're used to in their daily lives there. This screenshot is from the first recording of a yopi, as my genie friends call them. You can see the unnatural quality of the recording on full display as Gurai, who he passed away back in 2015. He argues with Emma about who is going to find a topic for the camera. He says to her, how about you guys think of something of yours to talk about and then talk about it, in response to her telling him to find a topic. Because, like the Patty Epps quote I shared at the beginning of this talk, I also kept finding so much grammar and linguistic practice happening around me that I knew to differ so greatly from what was in the recordings. I've invested quite a lot in my notebooking practices. For instance, here where I spent 2 half-hour chunks one morning just describing with as much detail as I could how the social scene unfolded and the things that people said as I myself participated. The recordings that I've made, in as much as I am aware, they show people kidding around. There's examples of humorous uses of language, but not one exchange of jokes between people in a joking relationship. The register, its role and importance to social life, the grammar of joking, not to mention the role of culture, are not recoverable from the corpus. Bumbuarkna happens in unpredictable, fleeting exchanges, only in particular kin relationships. So documenting it audiovisually is hardly realistic. Accomplishing this would require an invasiveness of incredibly unethical proportions into people's lives, tantamount to CCTV surveillance. Bumbuarkna can only be documented analogically. Don't get me wrong here, my point is not that we should necessarily do away with making recordings. Without the Chini documentation, it'd be impossible for me to report upon things like the grammar of clause chaining, or to know the functions of realis versus irrealis clause linkers. My level of Chini and my short-term memory are just not up to the task of writing those and other things down, certainly not on the fly. But while it is discussed here and there in the literature, documentary linguists have, to my knowledge, not really considered undocumentability to be an issue. In the face of undocumentable linguistic practices, often one encounters an ideology that says, well, the problem of having some linguistic practices unrepresented in the corpus can be solved through a more intensive or longer-term documentation than what has already been implemented. But what Bumbuarkna, along with other linguistic practices in other languages, as the references here point to, is that language in its fullness defies capture. So the question I'm really asking here is, will we change our gaze to what lies outside the frames of our cameras? Will we bend our methods toward the exigencies of sociolinguistic reality? Or will we continue to insist upon a narrow, technologically entranced view of what it means to do linguistic fieldwork? Before I conclude here in a few slides, I want us to just take a look at how documentary linguistics has influenced our thinking about fieldwork practice and issues of evidence. For starters, we would not aim for a corpora to be unrepresentative, but is our idea that they can be truly representative realistic when we consider the nature of language and culture and how big they are? Surely what documentation gives us is indeed just a snapshot. And so the approach to fieldwork and really to linguistics more broadly that I've been arguing against in this talk comes down to what I would call the empirical primacy of digital data. If we take a step back to see the larger picture of ideological change to the theory and practice of fieldwork that documentary linguistics has wrought over the past few decades, we can see how documentation has come to be singularly focused on the digital. And there are specific reasons for that, rooted in some of the advantages of digital data, especially in scientific terms. As T-Berger's rallying cry in his 2009 paper, which I've cited a couple times here, and also that of other documentarians, have contributed to bring this state of affairs about, we find ourselves in a time now where annotated digital recordings occupy that position of empirical primacy in current predominant theories of data. One thing this has led to is what I would call the rendering of field notes as a purloined letter in linguistics. Indeed, there are disadvantages to analog notes, but digital data are also riddled with problems of empiricity, things like the observer's paradox, but also the dependency of our interpretation and analysis on abstraction in our recordings extracted from evanescent events.